right. Welcome to the newest installment of TCU Presents. We have a real treat for everybody today. We're going to explore the topic of how we put chief executive officers in the spotlight. I need not tell you this, but as you know, leadership is truly at the heart of every organization, large, small, in between. But what's really interesting about the concept is that behind the notion of leadership actually lies a real human, an actual leader with a distinct personality. And that's really where we're going to focus today is, how might, a leader approach relationship building during the workday? How might that filter down to everyone, in the business, in the organization? And how might that influence how they work together? But today's leaders must also take multiple stakeholders, multiple audiences into account as they consider how they come across not only to their employees, but how they represent themselves to the board of directors as well as the broader marketplace. Leadership matters a great deal. It certainly matters to the public. And in some cases, CEOs have grown larger than life, almost acquiring a degree of celebrity-like status. I'm Daniel Pullen, and I have the distinct honor and opportunity to serve as the John V. Roach Dean here at TCU's Neely School of Business. I also have the chance to serve as a professor of entrepreneurship and innovation. And one of the most distinctive things about the Neely School of Business is our guiding force. So we call it the Neely Promise. It's a brand promise that, like CEOs, we make to our stakeholders each and every day. And it's a beautiful one sentence. It's inspirational, and it really reminds us of why we're here and how we move forward, really investing in the real assets of our enterprise, which are our humans. And the Neely Promise is this. It is to unleash human potential with leadership at the core and innovation in our spirit. And that really reminds us that any organization, it really is a sum of the sum product of aspirations of people, how those people can be brought together, and how they can generate, in the case of business, products and services that have the opportunity to not only create wealth, but benefit humanity as we know it. So thank you for joining us today at TCU Presents. The panel today is brought to you certainly by our Neely School, but also the TCU Alumni Association, TCU Magazine, and the Office of Social Media Management. And I think you'll agree we have assembled a great group of panelists today. I think that they will bring their unique experiences through their leadership journeys. And I think that they're going to be candid and be willing to share, true actionable insights that speak to how a personality can help shape a culture. So without further ado, let me introduce today's guests. First, Megan Hayes is Managing Director on Kimmeridge's public investment team. She has 15 years of experience in leading investor relations, strategic communications, capital markets, ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues within both public and private organizations, primarily in the energy industry. Prior to joining Kimmeridge, Ms. Hayes served as the VP of Investor Relations at Ceramex Energy. And before that, she was VP of Investor Relations and Public Affairs at Concho Resources, where she led investor relations in addition to developing and driving the company's ESG strategy. She holds a certificate for the Executive Education for Sustainability Leadership Program from Harvard. She received a BA in Political Science from TCU, and she currently serves on the advisory board of our Ralph Lowe Energy Institute. Welcome, Megan. All right. Next is Carlos Treadway, who's joining us today from London, England, where he's the CEO of Ford Credit Europe. He's responsible for 11 distinct European markets. FCE operates as a licensed bank. Ford Credit provides a variety of branded automotive financial products and services to both Ford customers and dealers. And as Ford Money, FCE also offers savings products to customers in both the UK and Germany. Since beginning his Ford Credit career as a customer service rep in Fort Lauderdale, Carlos has had a broad global career with increasing responsibilities over the last 28 years. He originally moved to the UK as Ford Credit's executive director for marketing and sales after serving as VP for North American Business Center operations. Before that, he spent close to 7 years in China as president of Ford Automotive Finance China, Regional Operations Director and Business Development Manager for Ford Credit Asia Pacific. As CEO, Carlos is focused on delivering lifetime customer relationships, integrating go-to-market strategies, innovative financing solutions to support Ford's electrification plans, which is very interesting right now, operational efficiency, and strong risk management and regulatory compliance. Carlos, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
All right. And finally, Dr. Joseph Harrison, who's my colleague here at the Neely School of Business. He is an assistant professor of strategy in our Department of Management and Leadership here at Neely. His PhD in strategic management was earned at Texas A&M, and his BS in business administration was received from the University of Richmond. His research deals with behavioral aspects of corporate executives and directors, and his research is conducted primarily in the areas of strategic leadership and corporate governance. His work has been published in the top journals in the field, including the Academy of Management, Academy of Management Review, the Strategic Management Journal, and Organizational Science. Prior to coming to academia, Joseph worked as a consultant for PwC in Washington, D.C., and as a financial assistant to the CFO of Partner MD, a startup concierge medical company in Richmond. He describes his greatest passions as strategic management, faith, family, and it's pretty topical, folks, football. Hi, Dr. Harrison.
Hey, thanks, Daniel. Good to be here.
All right. Well, since I ended with you, I'm going to start with you. So get ready. So your research, it studies in large part how psychological factors can affect the performance of a firm. So what got you interested in this relationship between personality and business?
Yeah, I guess, Daniel, you could kind of say I've always been interested in personality. What's not to like about examining personality, but really the origin of my research came during my undergraduate studies when I was introduced to the classical view of the economic man, which is basically this idealized view of human beings as perfectly rational and as always working in a way to maximize their personal satisfaction and utility. And that just kind of rubbed me wrong. It's a overly simplistic assumption. What kind of was tough for me to swallow in particular was the idea that my professors acknowledged that it was an oversimplified assumption, and yet it provided the basis for many of the models that we were learning, the efficient market hypothesis and other things we were learning about. And so fast forward then to my doctoral studies, and I got interested in behavioral economics, which kind of relaxed some of those assumptions and led me to start studying strategic leadership, understanding that organizations are not just static and really I guess inhuman objects like you were talking about at the beginning. We have humans at the top of the organization, behind the scenes, who are leading these companies, who come with different biases, different personalities, who can affect organizations based on what they bring. And so that's what really got me interested in that topic, and viewing business that way as not just a kind of static model, but as a dynamic model that includes human judgment and biases and personality.
Yeah, well, maybe on that last point, sort of, given the fluidity of it all and sort of the, sort of emerging link between possibly, personality, professional image, and corporate performance. I'd love to get some commentary from both, maybe first Megan and then Carlos. How much of your time do you spend thinking about your professional image and the sort of the resonant impact it could make, either in a positive or a negative way? I suspect image is never neutral. It's one way or another. So how much time do you think about that, and what kind of decisions are influenced by it?
Yeah, great question. I would say for the first decade of my career, I firmly believed in just putting my head down and executing. I think this served me well. It led to more responsibilities, but ultimately I was viewed as a taskmaster as opposed to contributing to the strategic direction or the vision and leadership of the firm. So I think everybody has a catalytic moment in their career where I realize it's not just about keeping your head down and executing, but it's really about keeping your head up and executing, and the importance of making connections, cultivating those connections, and in turn being in tune with how the world perceives you and honing your presence. So I wouldn't say I allocate a specific portion of my time every day to thinking about myself or my image, but I would say that it's part of how I approach the decisions I make around career moves, and how I really approach what I bring to the table at a presentation or a round table, and how I think about the guiding principles around the companies I join.
Excellent, right? I mean, I think that the notion of obviously keeping your head up and sort of looking being awake to the things around you and how you might connect either humans or processes or decisions to help you execute not only for the task at hand, but also to kind of drive broader participation with others that need to go with you. Carlos, what do you think on this?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I spend a significant amount of my time thinking about my professional image, but it is on my mind. What I spend most of my time thinking about is how am I showing up as my whole self, both internally and externally, because I think that's really important. It's interesting. I was doing some refresher media training a few weeks ago, and the media consultant, after he got to know me, we started going through a few different scenarios. He told me, he said, you know what? Just be yourself. He said your natural personality, the way you engage and your demeanor is really, really comfortable. So as you're speaking externally with people that don't know you, the way you do that will be really important, and it's also really natural for me. Now, I have external board members, and I also have to do external road shows for investors. So that can be a little bit tricky. I think Dean Pullen, you mentioned corporate performance. I think it's going to always boil down to, are you delivering the corporate performance? But me being myself, I think what employees expect is to see the same Carlos when I engage with them internally as what they would see externally. So I really focus on being my whole self and not necessarily trying to cultivate a certain professional image.
Yeah, I get it, right? That authenticity that's often sort of prescribed these days, particularly as chief executives have had to deal with so many dimensions of uncertainty and change, and really being a human, and one that's very consistent inside and out of the organization. Maybe winning the day at some level in our modern times. Megan, let's drill down on that just a little bit further. You obviously have deep experience in investor relations. You're talking to individual shareholders, probably large pensions. I mean, a ton of different types of investors that are capitalizing, the companies that you've represented. What kind of questions are coming up around company leadership? What are they, and maybe even specifically, since they're in the spotlight today, what do they want to know about the CEO?
Yeah, great question. I mean, and I think what Carlos just said is going to permeate our whole conversation today, that notion of authenticity, showing up as your whole self. I'll tell you, investors are smart people, and they can sniff that out so quickly when they see an inauthentic leader. And so I think what questions they try to drive towards the CEO or to the investor relations team really tries to uncover or unpack the integrity of the team and the CEO in particular, how the long-term vision is informed by the CEO or it's the team around him or her. So how the CEO views the world. Do they have a growth mindset that's open to change and adaptive to market dynamics, supply and demand shifts, and new technology? I think now we're seeing a lot of focus on the ability for a CEO to cultivate bench strength and develop a team. And we're having really candid conversations about succession planning. And that takes an element of humility on behalf of the CEO or the C-suite in general. And I think something else, also kind of keying in on something Carlos just said around delivering results. I think investors want to see alignment. And so this isn't necessarily a personality trait, but it is something that's really critical, and that's financial alignment. How much skin is in the game for the CEO, the ownership that they have in the company, because that can really drive decisions in the way the CEO steers the direction of the organization.
Yeah, and it's really, I mean, it's that's a multi-dimensional set of expectations, right? It's hard to imagine that all of those, characteristics, can even exist in one human, right? But it sounds like given the nuances of our times, CEOs really have to be attuned to what those expectations are, just to earn the right to lead in many respects. Carlos, let's take a global view, right? You've worked all over the world. You've obviously specifically in the United States and China and across 11 markets in Europe, to name a few. What do you think about culture, like, sovereign level culture? How does that impact management style, or how a CEO might be expected to present themselves? Or is it to the point where, business is so global to, these days that, a one size fits all approach can be, successful?
Yeah, it's definitely, in my experience, it's not a one size fits all, especially around management and culture. There's a lot of different surveys you can take around management style and how that fits with culture. And before I went to China, I took one of the surveys, and what it told me is the way I manage is direct opposite of what's expected from a Chinese culture. And so being very direct is not the way you would operate in China. So it's really important, I think, from a cultural lens, you understand as a manager and definitely as a CEO, what's expected, how you interact, and then even externally, it's very similar type of approach as you engage with external investors or customers or dealers in my respect. What's expected, for example, when you go out to visit clients in China, the way you engage is much different than what you would see in the US or the UK. There's cultures and the things that they enjoy in China that you would not see. And so the expectation as a CEO is that you would, celebrate that culture in that way. There's also an annual party or an annual celebration in China that all corporations do. And it's a really, really good celebration. The senior leadership team actually does a show as part of that celebration. And you would never see something like that in the United States. So that's a key difference. Then over here in Europe, even culturally, it's much, much different. I think the external professional image of the CEO in Europe is probably a bit more buttoned up, less casual, and probably more formal than what you would see in the United States. But even the way the team interacts here, it's completely different. You would think it would be very similar to the United States, but it's not. What I think is the same, though, is that when you go as an American or as a foreigner working in another country, they're expecting you to be that person. And I always remember that living in a different country, you're a guest in that country, and so you need to respect the culture and the way the business operates there. So I would say, my experience, but it is different. Same, the business is the same, but the way you manage it, the way you lead it, and the way you engage with the employees internally, and then the way you engage externally is much different. So.
I got it. Yeah. So, I think thanks for adding those layers, right? I think to Megan's very good, list of attributes and competencies, adding something around, being culturally competent is at a premium if you are really going to operate, globally and at scale these days. Okay, so now that we've kind of have a sense for what people are, asking about and in many ways expecting of CEOs, domestically, globally, et cetera, let's talk about sort of the way and the circumstances surrounding when when CEOs are making, say, more public external statements. For example, they might be asked and maybe even grant an interview request to the media. So Joseph, let's go back to you. Talk to us about some of the examples or things that you've been researching and cataloging around things CEOs say, right? And particularly because it's really interesting to me anyway, that maybe have caused them, right, a little trouble, or their firm a little trouble, or maybe impacted a company's growth.
Yeah, that's a great question. Really interesting question as well. As you mentioned towards the end, if you think about growth and kind of long-term viability and sustainability, what I've found is it's not really any given single statement that a CEO will make, but it's kind of this image that is developed over time. As Megan said, investors are smart, they're savvy. Customers we have access to all sorts of different information and Twitter feeds and Facebook accounts, and can see, press releases, everything that's going on with the company, and how this kind of more consistent image of a CEO is portrayed can lead to positive or negative effects for a company. And I can't help but reference Elon Musk here, because I think it's at the forefront of a lot of media outlets right now. His recent relationship with Twitter, and some of the things that have gone on in that relationship, we've seen, it's been tumultuous since the beginning. Kind of being on the board, but then not being on the board, saying he's going to buy it, and then being sued because he backs off and says he wasn't going to buy it, and now is realizing he needs to go in and do the deal, and some of the changes that have come in the less than a month that he's been the primary owner and CEO. There's a great article by CNN writer Jennifer Korn that kind of overviews all of that, but in summary, it's just been kind of tumultuous, and I think that's hurt Twitter, from being at a all-time high with their stock performance in 2021 to having this kind of major drop, and the future is unclear. And one of the things that I'll point to is kind of a contrast to that. One of the greatest criticisms recently has been his efforts to downsize and to lay off employees. Which in and of itself, it's a tough decision. A lot of firms kind of are put in a position where they need to do this at times. But if you compare that event at Twitter to other organizations, I'll point out one of Mary Barra at GM coming in 2017. Her mission, her vision was to be better by being smaller. And I think she approached the layoffs and some of the downsizing in a bit more calculated way, to where you ask about growth. GM has gone from filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy and needing a bailout to, over her tenure, she's been probably one of the most influential GM executives or CEOs over the entire history of that company, and has led them really into strong growth prospects for the future as well. And so you kind of see it's not even necessarily the actions that are being taken, but the context that surrounds them, the interactions with the market, with customers, with employees, and how, like Carlos was talking about, how it's managed. It's just really interesting to see some of those differences between firms, and I think that's one example, but there are many others that you could point to where personality, your approach, your image can have a big impact on your firm outcome.
Yeah. So given that correlation of a CEO being in a position to actually influence the, both perception and otherwise, the ability to drive that performance, which I think Carlos said so well was important, then it's important to get it right, whether it's a public interview or any other type of communication. And Carlos, you said earlier that you've been doing some refresh on, media training and getting some feedback. That may be, one of several ways you prepare for public interviews. And I'd love to hear sort of your approach and strategy to being as influential as possible, particularly given the tie to performance. So maybe even more specifically, how do you balance your whole self, your authentic self, with the entirety of the Ford brand? Are they inherently consistent? Are there, times when you have to create multiple personas? How do you make sure you get this right?
So I'm not clever enough to create more than one persona. So I think I'm lucky to say that I'll just be myself. What I say is, like I said earlier, what's expected internally is very similar to what's expected externally. But what I think is important as a leader is that you leverage all the things that make you you as you tell the story, in my case, for Ford or Ford Credit, or for whatever the firm is. So as I prepare, we have a communication lead, and she'll prepare most of the stuff. And I'll read and I'll look at it and I'll say, that's probably not the way I would say it. What's the message that we want to deliver, and how can we ensure that it represents my voice in me? And so people know, wow, that's something that Carlos would say. And so that's the balance I try to find. How can I leverage all the things that make me who I am as a leader, ensure that I'm representing, both Ford and Ford Credit externally when I do it. It's back and forth. I think your communication team, in Megan's case, the investor relation team, has to provide a lot of that help, and they have to really know the leader or the executive that they're working with as well, so they can get you most of the way there, and then you can kind of put the finishing touches. I'm sure it's pretty much the same for you, Dean Pullen. As you go out and speak, you get all of these speaker notes and all this, and you say, okay, I like it. I'd say it this way, I'd say it that way. Does it still deliver the message? So that's kind of their approach. So not two personas. I really focus on what makes me the leader that I am, ensure that I can leverage that as I'm communicating.
I get it. I mean, I think, that consistency between, the message to be delivered and the authentic voice of the human that is the CEO, right? If you can get those two things in alignment, then I think you can drive that credibility that will, move others again to respond in accordance with the strategy and the plan as you drive performance. Megan, I know you've had opportunities to have conversations with your CEOs to get them to think about not only what investors are concerned with, but sort of make sure that congruity that Carlos talked about, can be resonant in them as they approach, the public markets. How do you convince executives to listen?
Yeah, I think Carlos teed me up really well for this one, so thank you. I mean, this is an essential role for investor relations. You're at the center of receiving, filtering, and responding to investor feedback. And I think CEOs who are open-minded, who have a growth mindset, who really understand that investor feedback is a central piece of the overall feedback loop, then they'll be receptive to kind of understanding and hearing both positive and negative feedback. We used to call it, an Oreo or the compliment sandwich, where you lead with the positive, you put some room for improvement in the middle, and then you end with positive. And I feel like that little strategy has always worked really well for me. But investors have so much information at their fingertips, and they're triangulating that information, and they can really provide insightful views that can help inform the near term and the long-term strategy. And so it helps paint the mosaic for management. And I really haven't had any resistance when kind of sharing feedback, thankfully.
That's great. That's probably a pretty great track record, which is why you're so good at what you do. Joseph, you're really good at research. I know that. You've been researching a lot about, public image, at the C-suite level. What advice would you give to company leaders about how they cultivate their image?
Yeah, I think it goes back to a lot of what Carlos and Megan are talking about. It's this careful balance between authenticity, I think, and self-regulation. Being your true self is important, but being aware of your tendencies and managing those as well. There's a difference between being yourself and being, I don't know, obnoxious, right? Or there's a difference between being yourself as a U.S. executive, as Carlos was talking about, and being in China or in Europe, and altering and managing your behavior accordingly to show respect. And so I think if I were to sum it up to three things, I think the first thing would be to learn your tendencies. Things like the personality tests that Carlos mentioned, or leadership style tests, understanding, okay, this is how I approach things. That gives you a first piece of information. But the additional steps then would be to implement systems and checks to ensure that you're adjusting your behavior in appropriate ways. Whether or not we know let's say, even if we know our tendencies, we're still likely to behave according to our tendencies. And there's really the father of behavioral economics, Danny Kahneman, made this point really well, and suggesting that this is why we need systems to manage behavior. We'll have these tendencies, so having different touch points, people like Megan in her previous roles in investor relations, understanding, hey, let's, in the same way that investors would triangulate at the C-suite level, let's triangulate on some of the information, the communications that we're going to be putting out, make sure that it's addressing all of our stakeholders' needs. And that's probably point number 3 then, is to have a strong strategy that emphasizes value creation and emphasizes and incorporates the needs of your stakeholders. I think, as we come into this current age of business, we've seen some changes in what's expected of businesses. In 2019, there was a public statement by the Business Roundtable that kind of changed the view of what a business is for, to incorporate longer term strategizing, not being so subsumed with the short term market stock returns, and to incorporate stakeholder needs and address them accordingly. So I think having that more holistic view of an organization, learning your tendencies, and having the checks in place to make sure you're managing yourself in appropriate ways can go a long way to putting forward a strong image, and also to managing your organization to create value.
Especially in a changing context, right? Whether that was the 2019 statement, or some values and views, what will hopefully be a post-COVID world. As we look ahead, really putting all 3 of those steps against the changing context of our time seems to be have a degree of wisdom as well. We've talked about personality. It's come up. I think I've heard the word 6 or 7 times already in this discussion. So I'd love to drill down on that for a bit. Megan, as you think about personality traits, right? What would an investor cherish the most in a leader? And does it differ from, the personality traits that, say, the employees in that company would cherish the most?
Yeah, I think there are synergies between what investors cherish and what employees cherish. I think, just to drill down a little bit on investors in particular, they want to see optimism, and that optimism kind of infiltrate the vision. Now, I may be jaded a little bit by my sector I've played in for the last 16 years, spent my whole career in the oil and gas sector, and we might be the most optimistic bunch in the whole market. So, but I do think that investors really cherish optimism. They cherish an obsession. They want that CEO to have an obsession with the market that they're playing in, that they understand the history of that market, how innovation might be steering the market in a different direction, how it might create risks and opportunities to the business, and what could the future hold. And they want a leader that appreciates that history, can learn from it, and integrate it in strategy. I think tenacity, again, being in this sector, it's a very difficult sector on the government relations and public affairs front. And they want to find people that have a personality that's tenacious and willing to communicate and have difficult decisions with people that might oppose you, along with flexibility. I was in a situation where we reported disappointing results for the quarter, and we downgraded our outlook, and our equity price fell by more than 15% in one day. And the C-suite's next steps were critical for restoring credibility with the market. And we didn't hide from the challenge. We confronted it head on. We shed assets, we bought back shares, we improved the well performance, cash costs, and margins. And I think, course correcting quickly is something that investors also cherish. Now, if I switch gears over to employees, like I said, there's some synergies. I think a CEO that can not only set the vision, but communicate that through the workforce is critical. And so having a personality trait that really embraces strong communication skills, the ability to set the tone at the top, whereas the employees can cultivate the culture of the company. I think that takes compassion, a sense of community, and trustworthiness to drive this outcome in a way that drives really a purpose-driven company. And I think, just to put a bow on this for a second, I think humility and grit and resilience in the face of challenges is critical too. We're in earnings season for the sector, and I was just listening to Diamondback's earnings call. And in response to a question from an investment analyst, the president of the company responded that their exceptional performance was due to the culture of the company, and that culture never settling for less. And I think in that one response, he not only showcased the excellence of his team, but he had the humility to pass the praise on to the team. And I think that's powerful. And so I think that there's some synergies between investors and employees, but you really have to have some really unique aspects of that personality that helps both sets of stakeholders.
Yeah. Well, I want to bridge off of what you said there at the end, the sort of the unique aspects of personality. Carlos, obviously you have a wonderful personality. Probably there are some unique aspects to your specific personality. How do you take those aspects and embrace them in the way you lead, and how do you lead for effective outcomes, operationally or otherwise?
Yeah. So, Megan just did a fantastic job listing all of the personalities for a CEO and the synergies. That's a really interesting question. And if I think about, how I leverage my personality, I'm a relationship person, and I really believe it's important to spend time on relationships, and I don't take that lightly, especially with my direct leadership team. And I think if you're going to deliver outcomes and you're going to motivate people and you're going to encourage them, the more you know about that individual, the easier it is to work together to do that. Oftentimes, you can take the approach to try to lead without that, but in all of my years in leadership, and especially in the CEO role, what I found that if I look across my leadership team, there's nuggets about all of them that are really important to how they're going to lead their respective teams, how they're going to deliver outcomes. So I think spending time on relationships. And then the last piece I would say, I try to be a bit vulnerable. That can be difficult at times because oftentimes the CEO or the leaders expect to know all the answers. But being vulnerable can go a long way. And then the last piece I would say, Dean Pullen, is self-awareness and being self-reflective. What I started doing a few years ago was at the end of the week, I put some time on my calendar just to reflect on the week before. The days before, and say, how did those interactions go? How did those meetings go? How did I show up? As Megan said, did I communicate clear enough? Was I did I show enough optimism? Have I rallied the team in the way? And so, when I started doing that, I can replay the tape and say, here's where the opportunities to move forward. But I think it starts with the people and building those relationships for me, and them understanding who I really am, and me understanding who they really are is the way I try to operate to deliver the best outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very human approach to leadership. It sounds like, very inconsistent with sort of the theme of today. Having the courage to listen and learn about, the motivations of others and who they are as a person. The ability to translate that into action, and then the very important step of self-reflection. And taking time to think, not just do. Sounds like it's a secret to your success. Well, I know, Joseph, you've been researching this very topic, and so and have taken a really structured scientific approach to determining which traits best correlate with value creation and performance in the firm. What are some of your major takeaways?
Well, this session has been an academic's dream because a lot of what we've talked about really is validating to the research that I've done, thinking of things like that optimism, even the humility. There's been research on that, and that's consistent. I'm also writing down some ideas for future research ideas with some of what they're talking about. But what a lot of my research revolves around is what's referred to as the big 5 personality traits, which sort of subsume a lot of these other tendencies that we see. And those are extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and openness to experience. And so in looking at those 5 in particular, some of the interesting things that we've found, some are more surprising than others. Some that I would say are less surprising. We've found that neurotic CEOs, so neuroticism, is related to emotional instability, which is expressed through higher levels of stress and anxiety and impulsiveness. This would be kind of the Elon Musk example, if I may say so. And he's come out and said he's quite impulsive all on his own. So I'm quoting him by using that example. But that's significantly correlated with volatility and company performance. And reducing shareholder returns. And so that's one takeaway. Another one is that conscientiousness is key for executives. So how does that manifest for executives? A lot of these things that we've talked about, taking into account the different perspectives, being respectful, taking a calculated approach to strategy development and communications. We've found that more conscientious CEOs tend to take on less risk, but when they do, they take a more calculated approach that often leads to better growth opportunities and more value creation. So again, those 2 are a little bit more to be expected. The one that is interesting to me is extroversion, though. And extroversion, I think we all have an idea of what that is. It's a tendency to be outgoing and sociable, being ambitious and dominant and excitement seeking. A lot of these things that would be presumably related to leadership effectiveness. And there is a vast literature really on CEO extroversion and on leader extroversion and leading to emergence of leaders. This is how they get to the top. But once you're there, extroverts need to be careful. Because the relationship between taking on a lot of risky endeavors and those endeavors actually creating value is somewhat more tenuous. We can see it's based more on context, and oftentimes extroverts are less able to once there to turn risky endeavors into viable growth options. And so I think to some extent that's reflective of this idea of humility as well that Megan brings up. Although it's a separate, distinct construct, there's this idea of dominance taking root in extroverted individuals. you can't be the smartest person in the room all the time as an executive, right? You have to be able to lean on others and incorporate feedback, as we've been talking about, and be humble and be malleable to manage different situations with all of the uncertainty that we've been talking about. So I think those are some of the high level important takeaways that we can see. But really, to bring this to a conclusion, our personality of leaders is important, and since the beginning of my interest in this, kind of questioning that view of the economic man. The economic man, we are not, right? We all have our own tendencies, and that can have a big influence on how organizations are perceived, how they're led, their future value creation and growth opportunities.
Oh, that's fascinating, and some of it's confirmatory, and some of it is unexpected and actionable. And it sounds like you've got a whole pipeline of research ideas as a result of the discussion. One of the tendencies that I have is to figure out what people care about and to work kind of backwards from the marketplace. And I want to work backwards from the marketplace of questions that have been streaming in through the course of this discussion. There are a couple that I think we'll have time for. The first one from one of our audience participants is this: what role does social media play in a CEO's image, particularly now when everything can be shared everywhere all the time? And that's a jump ball question for anybody to get in on.
Yeah, I will share my thoughts. I think, as Megan said, investors have all the information they need. But I do believe social media gives an opportunity for customers and even some investors to see really who that CEO is. And it also gives an opportunity to tell the stories that you can't tell in other forums. But on the flip side of that, it also is an opportunity for customers to engage directly with that CEO. And so you want to be, if you're going to do that, you got to be prepared, for one, to take the feedback. You got to be prepared to engage in those forums. But I think it's a really, really great opportunity now with social media, if used in the right way, for that CEO to tell the story that they want to tell, to be themselves, and to engage in some fun and entertaining moments for customers, investors to see. So that's my view.
Okay, great. Other thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think Carlos really summarized that really well. I would add maybe two things. One is that once the CEO gets into that social media platform, consistency is key. So you can't decide when you're going to engage and when you're not going to engage. And so I've observed that across a lot of different industries, and executives kind of being a little bit more guarded when maybe pressures are high, and when pressures are lower, kind of getting fully engaged. I think you got to be consistent through all of those times. I think the second thing I would add is that the concept of always being on, and I know that even the best CEOs need to be able to indulge in football and put their feet up and cheers, normal part of the fans in the crowd. But social media, to the questioner's point, means that we're always on, because anything can be captured and transmitted on a dime. And so from that perspective, I think it creates some challenges on stress of CEOs, and that's a whole nother probably research project for Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the questions I've been interested in. It's great to hear your perspectives on that. I do think it's a double-edged sword, right? You can tell your story, you can show an authentic, genuine self, but man, with cancel culture and all these additional pressures that we see with customers in particular, it can be a real issue at times. So I think this goes back to one of those other points of having a good team around you, right? And having systems and checks in place to ensure that consistency, as Megan's talking about, and also avoid some of the missteps that executives can make on social media.
Yeah, it sounds like it's kind of either you're all in or you're all out, and an in between approach. You could actually end up doing maybe more harm than good. From setting and then managing expectations of your constituents, right? Whether they're internal or external. In the case of social media. Okay, great. The other question that I'll pose from the audience is: does the post-COVID world require a CEO to show more of their personality than before, especially given so many uncertainties around our economy?
Megan, you should take that one first.
Oh, I was waiting for you, Carlos. I don't know if it's necessarily more personality. I think it's being more communicative. And so if I remember the depths of COVID, and in our industry, oil turning negative even for a day or two, we were having calls 2 times a day, morning and night, to check the pulse of the employee base, discuss safety protocols, and then of course the company's performance and strategy and how we were going to navigate. And I think that some companies have probably backed off of that as things kind of start to normalize. I think what we realize is that it's a whole new normal, and it requires that same commitment to communication. Maybe not morning and night, but it requires that same kind of, to Carlos's point earlier, bringing your full self to the office every day, and really being in tune to the world around you in order to make the best decisions for your employees and other stakeholders.
Yeah, I think that's a really good summary. The only thing I would add to that, I don't think it's personality driven per se, but I do think it's made CEOs react more quickly to significant events. If you think about where all of us were when COVID started, and the thousands and thousands of employees that went from showing up to an office every day to working from home, in most industries, outside of the economic devastation, but most industries didn't miss a beat. And there's a lot of firms that would have never done that if COVID didn't force that. And so, as Megan said, I think it's the decisiveness. I also think that it forced a lot of CEOs to look deeper at the people actions and what the company had set up to care for employees. So I think this brought a lot of things to the surface in a lot of different firms that allowed or required CEOs to, one, communicate differently, communicate more, and communicate often. In the firms that got that right, you can tell from the employee satisfaction and attrition. But I think that's the way I would describe it.
Yeah, I think the juxtaposition of these two questions is interesting to me. I think this latter question really hits on some of the employee-facing relationships that you have. The nature of work has changed to a large extent in many organizations, and this is what the research is showing, right? It's very difficult to maintain a culture when you have hybrid or at-home working conditions, and yet that's something that many employees see as valuable. And so I think, not necessarily the strategies for managing a company have changed in terms of managing your public image or how you interact, but it's basically on steroids now that you need to have a consistent communication. You need to be able to inspire and encourage with a strong vision and mission. And just like Megan was talking about at the beginning, having the leader at the top to set that tone is incredibly important to then have the employees decide, all right, how are we going to implement this and create a culture that works for our given organization? And it's not going to be a one size fits all, right? It's going to differ depending on the industry, the nature of the business and competition. And so I think this latter question really gets at that relationship with employees. I think the former question about social media really gets more at the, to some extent investors, as Carlos was saying, but more so customers. But this holistic view of taking into consideration all of your stakeholders, your investors, your customers, your employees, suppliers, the society at large, the communities that you're working in. I think those are the broader changes that we've seen over time, to where executives managing how they manage, if I can say it that way, has become more important.
Well, I think collectively, the three of you have helped us sort of set the tone for what the future of leadership looks like in a changing world, and I want to thank you for that. We've covered a lot of ground today. We started off by talking about just the plain realization, given the digital transformation in our society, given the effects of COVID, given geopolitical turmoil, so many pressures and forces, that we have to recognize that organizations are truly fluid creatures, and that to execute today, it's no longer good enough to just keep your head down and crunch through whatever the task of the moment is, but that there's tremendous value in keeping your head up and really leaning into connections that can help people go with you and go together. A lot of time spent on showing up as one's whole self, right? To be very consistent both internally and externally in your organization, and doing it with an air of authenticity that may be more valuable today than it has historically been cherished. I love the discussion on what investors are looking for out of a CEO. The plain reality is that you have to have a long-term vision, a global worldview, a growth mindset, comfort with technology, the humility to engage in succession planning and alignment with all aspects of their day-to-day work and the words they say as they go to the marketplace. Recognizing, though, that there are differences in marketplaces. A one-size-fits-all approach to how the CEO portrays themselves, it might be a little different in, say, China or in the UK than it is in the US, which puts an added premium on being culturally competent as a CEO. The notion and the pitfalls of using social media, the importance of being very, very consistent in your message to deliver, a regular and true voice of the CEO in a way that aligns with not only the message that the organization needs to get to the marketplace, but that it can be embodied in a credible messenger that reflects who the CEO is as a human. And CEOs have the opportunity to be regularly reminded, it sounds like, that investor feedback is a big component of all the feedback loops they receive as they choose how and where to compete, how and where to lead. And then some really great discussion around tendencies, right? Understanding your tendencies, not learning about them, right? But also implementing systems and checks and balances to make sure that some of those tendencies can be leveraged the right way and don't end up creating pitfalls. And then a real strategy to come behind all of that to create value across all stakeholders. I love the difference in traits that were discussed between external and internal, stakeholders. The external view of that investors are looking for optimism. They're looking for an obsession with the markets in which they compete. Right. The importance of innovation and the tenacity to get it all done. Versus employees who are really looking for that vision and understanding through communication, right, how it applies to them and how they can be additive to the whole. The notion on relationships and being patient and having the courage to learn about others so that you can drive decisions, and then the ability to explain and communicate the implications and the rationale for those decisions. And then this notion, this trade-off between conscientiousness and extroversion, and how extroversion, right, might help you get to the top, but it may not be the most important trait to keep you right there. And so the more conscientious leader we've seen through research is best positioned to take on less risk and drive more return, which drives value and sustainability in our enterprises. So I don't know how much you could cover in an hour beyond what these thought leaders did today, but I'm just so pleased to have been a part of this fascinating discussion and how humans practice leadership. I want to say thanks again to Megan Hayes and Carlos Treadway, Joseph Harrison, our partners at TCU Magazine, the TCU Alumni Association, which you can check out at alumni.tcu.edu and on Horned Frogs Connect. Always read up on the latest happenings at the Neely School of Business at neely.tcu.edu and across the university at magazine.tcu.edu. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your fall, and go Frogs.